Hello, everybody. My name is Mark Deal. I'm with Document and Data Solutions. Today, we're going to be doing part 2 of the roadmap to implementation for Actionstep and what it really looks like to migrate your data from a legacy application into Actionstep. Like most of you, I'm not a huge fan of reading PowerPoint slides, so I'll do my best to avoid doing so. Instead, I'm really going to focus on some things to consider when migrating legacy data to Actionstep. I'll point out some gotchas, offer some ideas, and do my best to answer your questions at the end. I've been involved with legal technology for 25 years. I've focused on the back-end technologies, meaning the techie, geeky stuff like SQL Server and how practice management systems store their data. I've done about 20 migrations to Actionstep involving Amica's Attorney, Time Matters, PC Law, Juris, Aderant Total Office, Filevine, and Zola Suite. So here's what we're going to be doing and going over today. It may surprise you to see the topic, deciding what data to migrate, as part of this presentation. I mean, after all, we want all of our data, right? So maybe and maybe not. For example, do we want our note that we made in 2008 reminding us to pick up pizza on the way home to come over to Actionstep? What about personal events dating back to 2010? I have vacation events in my legacy database going back to 2002 that I really no longer care about. So how do we want to clean out this information? Does the legacy application allow us to process batches of data without harming related data that we need to keep? Or do we clean up the data after migrating to Actionstep? Well, it's really an apples and apples or not oranges kind of a discussion, because each migration they each present their certain challenges. For example, dates in Actionstep are stored in universal coordinated time format, which is just a long way of saying that everybody agrees what time it is. It's based on the Greenwich Meridian in London, England. That's basically at some point somebody drew a line and said, today at this point it's noon. And then if you go backwards for a certain period or certain distance, maybe, New York might be a different time, and France might be a different time, and so on and so forth. So the whole point of that is that it makes perfect sense, since this is a cloud-based application, that if I open an event or I create an event in Los Angeles, and I want to meet with my colleague in New York, and I put in as a 9 o'clock meeting, well, it's going to be 9 o'clock for the person in Los Angeles, but it's going to be noon for the person in New York. So most legacy systems, like Time Matters, for example, they use the local time of the system. So if our LA user enters a meeting for 9 a.m., then our New York user will see that on their calendar for 9 a.m. as well. These two users are never going to meet, because their appointments will be 3 hours apart, but they don't see it that way. They see it at 9 o'clock in the morning for both of them. It's just not going to be feasible. But Actionstep accounts for this naturally. You put an appointment in at 9 o'clock in LA, it's going to show up at noon for the user in New York. So I ran into this issue for a client with a system on the West Coast when I ran the conversion locally from my office on the East Coast. As data imported, 9 a.m. in my time zone migrated to 6 a.m. in theirs. Lesson learned. So clearly migrations have their challenges, and most of these challenges come from legacy data. Can we access the data outside of the application? I mean, how do we get to it? In other words, do we have to have Amica's Attorney installed to access its underlying data? Another example, if you're currently on a very old version of Amica's Attorney that does not utilize SQL Server, then their databases are pretty locked down, because, let's face it, they didn't want to make it easy to migrate to another platform. Now that they're on SQL Server, we can get to all of that data very, very easily and migrate that over to Actionstep. Okay? In the case of an older version of something like Amica's Attorney, or something that's really kind of proprietary, something that uses a Paradox backend or something like that, and I know this is techie geeky, in that case, we would recommend exporting as much data as possible in the form of reports or other export options that's provided within the software. This today is typically a last resort, and in 99 times out of 100, it's not necessary. So migrations, they go through a certain process, and the process may differ for each system that you migrate from. So the first part of this process is really deciding what data to migrate clearly. And then what we typically want to do is set up Actionstep. And that kind of sounds backwards. Well, don't you have to go get your data first? Well, you kind of do, but what we want to do is recognize that we're moving to a new system. We're going to ignore that legacy data for now. We're going to set up a new system and take all the experience that we've had in the past and apply it here, building what we want to build. And it's hard to get past most people, but honestly, set up a system first and then start looking at your legacy data. You can add fields at any time that capture non-standard data such as blood alcohol levels for a DUI case or the total value of life insurance for an estate planning matter. Keep it simple. If you go back to when you set up your last system and you had all the knowledge about that system that you have today, wouldn't you set it up differently? So until you use Actionstep in its most basic form, or not most basic, but more basic form, you may not understand all the power that it will bring to your firm. If you try to build out complex workflows, then you may overcomplicate a simple process. And it's because you really don't know Actionstep yet, and something that you put 15 steps into could have been done in 2. So until you use it, you're not going to really understand it or understand how exactly to set it up. Of course, you can work with consultants. You can really noodle this out as much as you'd like, but you need to grow into the system, learning as you do so, because you're not locked down in any way. You can always move forward. So you don't need to complicate the migration. So for example, if you really got into Actionstep setup and you started building out workflows, then when you import your data, then you have to tell each matter which step that you might currently be on in Actionstep. And it just makes things more difficult, to be honest with you. Now, I also have another observation that might surprise you. Most business people do not completely understand their internal processes or what their staff do every day. I've been in more planning meetings than I can count where an attorney was describing some aspect of office workflow only to be interrupted by their paralegal who explains why they don't do it that way anymore. The more complex you make it, the more effort you will need to put into migrating your data. So the first part of all this, and the least obvious, is set up your users in the new system. And the reason you do that first is because you're going to need their unique identifiers when you migrate your data so that you can assign them resources like tasks, matters, and notes, and assign them to the proper user or users that own them. So if you set your users up, you can see within Actionstep what their unique identifier is for when you're importing data. And we're going to talk about that in a second. So take a good look at your data and what system that you're currently in, and ask yourself, can you access it in a way that makes it easier to map it into formats that Actionstep wants? Now, most systems can export data into spreadsheets, and Actionstep loves importing from spreadsheets. It's very, very good at it. Consistency. Did staff enter phone numbers in the right place? And so, for example, did they bring in and enter cell phone numbers in one place within your legacy system? Or are they kind of all over the place? One person did it here, one person did it there. The formatting is all different. Actionstep is going to allow you to have any number of phone numbers, email addresses, etc. The initial migration can be a challenge if that same data exists in different locations in your system. So something to consider, nothing to be terribly concerned about. Another part of this is security. As far as security is concerned, I just did a migration for a firm just a couple weeks ago. And they had implemented security within their legacy system because one of the partners of the firm hosted Alcoholics Anonymous meetings for the staff, the clients, other parties. And he maintained that data in their legacy system with security set so others in the firm could not see the data. You need to consider that and be aware of these things. Maybe there are lockdown matters that you shouldn't be seeing or shouldn't allow your staff to see that you need to also make sure are locked down or never make it into Actionstep. So the Actionstep can certainly control that security for you. It's very simple to do. But again, it's something you need to be aware of if you're going to bring in everything into Actionstep you need to maybe be aware of security concerns. Now, as I mentioned earlier, dates on calendars are important, and a lot of systems today will connect and synchronize with Office 365 or Google Workspace. Now, depending on how these systems are set up, you could run the risk of creating duplicate contacts, events, and to-dos during or after this migration. So you need to give careful consideration to, are you synchronizing with other systems? And how will that affect your ability to migrate to Actionstep without messing up any of the data? So it's never a crisis. You can always kind of fix things after the fact, but just keep it in mind that if you are synchronizing with these systems, you really need to kind of noodle that out and figure out if, how to move this forward. So deciding on what data to migrate. So what is important to you in terms of data that you have to migrate? I mean, clearly, we need contacts in the system before we can associate matters with them. So you want to import your contacts first. Keep in mind that your staff records or user IDs are also contacts in Actionstep and will be already set up in the system because, again, you need to be able to assign records to them during the import. So who owns the contacts that you're importing? Who's responsible for them? So that's why you want to create your users first, and then when you import the data, you probably don't want to bring those in, your staff in, if that's the way that your system is currently set up. So consider removing your staff from the import and setting them up manually as I've described. So how do you link matters to contacts and notes to matters and tasks to users? Well, the simple answer is by using a neat trick that Actionstep has during imports. It's called the external reference, and it is used to hold a unique identifier for each contact or matter so that you can import, for example, notes and relate them to the matter or contact that note should be associated with. So think of this external reference as the unique identifier or the system ID of each record in your legacy system. Time Matters will store that for you and allow you to link to it. It's really a very, very clever solution. And again, Actionstep is outstanding at bringing in multiple spreadsheets and keeping them organized for you. Okay, I'm trying to keep this from being too techie geeky, so I don't want to take this any further. But this is why Actionstep is very, very good at importing data. Okay, it's not as difficult as you would think. Okay, so when we move into, what's the data set? What data sets will interact or take priority? Obviously, contacts. We got to get our contacts in, or we can't link anything to them, right? The process is ripe though with the opportunity, to clean up your data prior to importing it into Actionstep. Everybody wants to clean up their data. They want to get rid of the duplicate contacts, something that happened in 1998, and they have all these duplicates throughout the system. They'd like to clean those up as part of this process. It's a great opportunity to do that, but keep in mind that it's not as easy to do that in any system as it might sound. For example, if I have a contact record for Mark Deal, and that record is duplicated, and I now have two Mark Deals. And in the process of working on Mark Deal's case, I assign that case to the first Mark Deal. And he comes in later on and opens another file with me, and I associate that with the other Mark Deal. I've got two duplicates that are linked to two different matters that really should be linked to the same contact. So when you're doing this and when you go in and try to clean this data up, keep that in mind that you need some kind of a placeholder, or you need to reassign that matter to the one contact record. And it's not as hard to do as you would think. It's just something to consider as you're doing this. Okay. Think here. So how do you link these things together? It's with that external reference, and it works great. Okay. All right, so if we kind of look at the duplicate record issue, you kind of have to weigh the value of that process against its benefits. Depending on the format that you have available to export your data, you may be able to use Excel's duplicate values process to help clean up the data. They have a very good way of recognizing duplicates within Excel. It's not all that complex, and something to look into if you do choose to go this direction. There are also a couple of third-party websites that do a pretty good job identifying duplicate records. It's just more of a challenge than you think. So if you can, clean up the data before it gets to Actionstep. It's a lot easier to do it externally before you bring it in than to go through the records within Actionstep to help clean it up. Okay? Point is, it can be done, but it's typically one-off solutions. Now, I often hear that we should ignore closed matters during imports. While that sounds valid in the initial overview, it may cause issues moving forward in terms of conflict checks. Most of the time, you want to bring as much data over as possible, but it really depends on your practice and the value of those matters to your practice. Would a conflict check even exist? Right? It depends on your practice areas. So finally, the big one, document migration. Most legacy systems we come across do not have a true document management system or DMS. A true DMS will hide access and provide security, so it hides access to the documents from end users and make it possible only to access the documents from within the application. Most legacy systems don't enforce this. So we always find documents that are not related to the proper matters, or they've been added to a folder structure outside of your legacy system. They're out there, and you use Microsoft File Explorer to go find them. So you can certainly relink those things together. It's not that difficult, but I don't recommend that you do it manually. I would instead maybe find a source that could help you do that through automation and relink these things together. We've done a couple of these for different firms, but it all depends on the structure of your file folders and your structures and how religious people were about how they stored documents. Most of the time lawyers are very good at it, and paralegals not so much. So really, never fear. Technology's here. It's fairly trivial to iterate over a well-organized file structure and fix those rogue links using basic programming so that we get all of those documents to come into Actionstep. Okay. The other good part of Actionstep is that it will full text index every word of every document in your system. Now, what does that mean? I bring that up a lot, and people their eyes glaze over. What does that mean? It means it's going to read your document and produce an index that is then searchable. So I can then search for the phrase document and data solutions, and it will find every single document that has that phrase in it. So, and it's very, very fast. So that's a way to find your documents as well. So don't worry so much about structure of the data that comes in. The folders can be reproduced exactly as you have them in your system today as part of that process. Okay? Now here's one good tip when you're talking about moving documents into Actionstep. No matter what, it's going to take some time to get your documents into the system. Right? You have to upload all of them to the cloud. Now, there are tools that Actionstep provides that allows you to do that automatically, and they work very, very well. But keep in mind that if you have a terabyte of data, which is not uncommon even in small firms, if you have a terabyte of data, it might take a little bit of time to upload all that data to the cloud based on your internet speed, based on the file sizes. Believe it or not, larger files move faster. It just depends on so many factors. But I will give you just a rough figure. How long will it take to get your documents into Actionstep? We've moved 1.2 terabytes, which is fairly common size, in a weekend. So it is possible. It was not an extremely fast internet connection. It was just an average firm. So you can move them pretty quickly. But the big tip that I wanted to bring up here is upload your documents in the order that they were last modified, in reverse. So you want the most recently modified document, not recently created, recently modified, because somebody was working on that. So you take the most recently modified documents and you send them up to Actionstep first. And by default, that's what some of their tools do if you use them correctly. So the goal here would be that you're going to walk into your office on Monday morning, you're going to see a terabyte worth of documents that have been most recently touched. So it's probably a year's worth at least, maybe 2 or 3, that you're going to have already in the system. And if it's all you have is a terabyte of documents, you should have that in a weekend and go live on Monday morning with everything that you have. Other times, you may have a slow internet connection. We ran into a firm just a couple of weeks ago that reboots their server every single night. So as we're running this process, they would reboot their server every night, and we just have to pick it right back up in the morning when we get into our office. So there are things to consider there. But the idea of how do I get my documents into the cloud, Actionstep will bring them in the same folder structure that you've currently got, and it works very, very well. So for a conclusion here, I don't want to read these. I don't know how I think they're pretty self-describing. The one thing that I do want to point out, though, is number 5 and number 4. So number 4 says import it into a trial database first. Actionstep has the ability to spin up a trial database for you. They can even take a copy of your configured database that hasn't got any data in it yet and copy it into a staging area. And you can actually do test imports on that. So you import your data, you review everything, maybe have your staff review it, determine what needs to be tweaked, what didn't come in properly, how can I fix it, rerun the import, test it again until it's right. And then you import into the live database. So that works really well. It causes no downtime whatsoever, especially if you take advantage of number 5. Conduct the training on the trial data. So you can be training on your data that you uploaded to that trial database, and nobody would see anything different than when you go live. So it's a nice way to do training on real information. Turn around and go live on a Monday morning, and everybody has exactly what they expected to see. I do want to bring up one last piece, and it kind of falls off topic, but it's kind of on topic as well. I hear a lot when we're first talking to people with these legacy systems and local databases. What happens if the internet goes down? My reply is more and more, when was the last time the internet went down for you? As opposed to your server went down, or you had server problems. So there are things to consider there, but the internet doesn't really go down, right? Maybe your office's access to it went down temporarily. Maybe you were out for an hour. But in this last year with the pandemic, it makes people appreciate and understand, especially my clients. I had a client move to Actionstep the week that they were shutting down the country. And they were so happy that they did because they could all work from home, they could all work from Starbucks, they could work from anywhere. So if the fear is, what if the internet goes down? I don't think that it does as often as you think, number one. And number 2, you can go work from anywhere. Send the office home, they can work from their houses. It's just one of those things to consider. Once you move to the cloud and you see how you can access this data from anywhere and have your documents and everything else at your fingertips or from your phone, it's really, really a lot of freedom that you suddenly feel. So I just had to bring that up. I think it's an important part of anybody that's looking at moving and migrating to the cloud. So with that said, a little brief about us in case you're interested. Our website, this is pulled directly from our website, so nothing hidden here or scary or anything else. But our website is docsol.com, stands for Document Solutions. So it's actually Document and Data Solutions, so we work a lot with both. And finally, I'm going to open this up for any questions whatsoever, and I hope that you'll try to stump me, see what we can address that I've already skipped over. We've got one here. Hang on a minute. How long will a typical migration take? And it really depends. Some of them take a lot longer than others. It depends on the data that you're moving, what the system is that you've got. I've got a lot of experience moving from, for example, Time Matters or Amicus, and those tend to be a lot faster because we've written so many tools to help with that. And Actionstep has written tools to help with that, and it makes it much simpler. Other applications, they can take a little longer. We're currently involved in one that is a one-off type of a thing. And it was a homespun system. And that's actually going very well because we can get access to their data, and it's pretty simple to move that stuff. So how long does it take? I've done Time Matters conversions in less than a couple of days. So that was pretty good. Will Actionstep convert my system for me? Actually, they won't. And I appreciate that very much because that's one of my jobs. I get to move people's data. But no, Actionstep will not do it because they are focused on being software developers. And they produce a system that we all use, and they tend to give this out to consultants and certified partners to help with that. I will tell you that you can move your own systems. You can convert your own data. It's a time-consuming process if you don't really know what you're doing and how it all works that way. So here's my answer to that. Anybody else at all? Any other questions whatsoever? Well, if not, I do want to thank everybody for joining and playing a part today. Oh, here we go. I've got one more. How many firms in Australia currently use Actionstep? The only answer I have officially, since I am in the States, I will tell you a lot of them. There's a ton of users in Australia. Actionstep is actually hosted in New Zealand, not hosted, they're hosted all over the world actually in multiple data centers. They started out in New Zealand, they jumped obviously over to Australia and did a lot of work there, then up to the UK, and they've made a huge drop into the United States. I think it's just gonna get better. So I don't have a number, I'm sure Actionstep can give it to you though. Anybody else? I will thank you all. I really do appreciate you attending. And if there's anything that does come up, please reach out to me, and I would love to hear from you. Thank you all.